So I'm here with Eddie Harran for another episode of The Future of X, and I'm talking to Eddie today about time and the future of time. Eddie, could you just introduce yourself and give us a little bit of an insight into who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name's Eddie. I describe myself as a temporal designer and futurist. Right now I run a little consultancy, and what we do is we help organizations and clients really think about time in a much more deeper way. And from that, really design systems and interventions and thinking that uplift and make better time. My background is, before I ran this consultancy of mine, I worked at Deloitte in a division called Center for the Edge, and I spent a lot of my time looking at the future, technology trends in work, trends in education. So there's a bit of a crossover in Benny's work and my work with my history. So yeah, and I am most passionate, and my mission is to help build time literacy and time education in the world.
Amazing.
That's sort of what I do.
Thanks, Eddie. I think that's a really interesting question. You propose this concept of time literacy and also just acknowledging the interdisciplinary nature of time. It's almost one of those things that seems a bit ridiculous to say because we don't often think of time as a literacy. We just think of it as something that permeates everything as almost like a background quality to life. But you're proposing this notion of time or temporal design as something that we do or that we engage with, more like a skill. How do you define temporal design? What actually is it?
The sort of current simple definition that I'm running with, and it's a kind of ongoing iterative process of trying to get to the essence. But right now, I think of it as the practice of thinking of time as a system that can be shaped, aligned, and reimagined to deliver a better outcome for X or a better system. The more extended definition and the premise behind that is really understanding that there are many times and many temporalities at play, and that there's a kind of temporal complexity going on everywhere. And from that premise, you can start designing time. And not just treating it as some sort of abstract sort of idea.
Right. So we think about time in different contexts in different ways. So sometimes we use fast time, sometimes it's more cyclical, sometimes it's felt in different ways.
Yeah. There's many different layers, all kind of interacting together. So like you said, our body cycles has a certain time, but also our cities have a kind of certain time in the way they move, or our political systems have certain times in the way they do elections in 4-year cycles. So when you kind of open the veil just a little bit, you begin to notice that there's a temporal component in everything. And with that knowledge, you can start redesigning it.
Amazing. So what are those methods or tools that you would use to help people design their time better?
I think the first thing is really becoming clear that time is designing you. In order to design your time, you need to be clear that it is designing every aspect of your life. So just a simple hack is to understand that everyone has a time bias. That means that some people are more present orientated. Some people are very future orientated, and others are very past orientated. And that comes from time psychology. And so understanding where your bias is, just in doing that, your time around you will be designed differently, just in becoming aware of your bias.
Yeah,
it's becoming aware of you. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I was only going to say it actually reminds me a lot of this notion of design thinking in a sense, like that concept of empathy is at the core of good design in general. And so, you're proposing a similar sort of sense of understanding or empathizing with people's natural inclinations towards time and how they perceive time.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought up the term empathy. A core part of what I think of temporal literacy is really developing empathy for everyone's temporal bubble that I'm in. And it's really helped my relationships. Like, when a certain person doesn't arrive on time, I'm like, oh, holy shit. That person is dealing with a lot of times. Their family, they're this, they're that. Oh, I can kind of adapt my time a little bit and understand where they're coming from. So it really helps in working relationships just to understand that everyone is dealing in their kind of little temporal world.
That's so fascinating. And it's actually touching on the last question that I wanted to ask you. And that's one of how time or our sense of time relates to our working life. If you think about work, it obviously has a pretty strong temporal bias towards 9 to 5 still, I think, the old Dolly Parton song. But it's changing, and I think it's becoming more flexible. How would you propose we, sense time differently, or how do you think this time literacy, when it gets to scale, will impact on our working life?
I'd say one thing is understanding, and I've seen a lot of firms and organizations talk about this more, but in chronobiology, they talk about the idea that we all have a chronotype. So some people are morning people, some people are evening people. And because of that, the way we kind of output our creativity and thinking is different for everyone. So that 9 to 5 structure might not work for everyone's chronotype. So, for example, I know I'm a night owl. That means my biggest ideas happen in the evening. So designing my working structure around that. So as we develop more temporal literacy about ourselves, how do we embed that knowledge in how we think about working lives, The other thing I think about is in the way, work, the digital time and physical time are kind of merging together. I just actually read an article this morning that talked about how Sunday evening is the new Monday morning.
Yeah.
And specifically around how digital has blurred professional and personal. And that's a real challenge, right? So how do we kind of have a better physical and digital integrated that kind of honors people's chronotype in their lives better? And it's going to be really interesting in the next 5-10 years of how we're going to deal with all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's certainly an interesting one, and it touches on so many different aspects of our organizational culture and psychology as well, because even if we are more empathetic for people's different time systems, we've still got to deal with the fact that in these digital environments, when we're sending emails or posting updates, those sometimes trigger notifications, which, regardless of our intention, might actually disrupt someone's personal life in a undesirable way. So it's a really interesting and complex space. And thanks so much for helping us to explore it, albeit briefly. Where could people go to find out more about the work that you do and learn a little bit more about temporal design, Eddie?
I think the best place right now, and where I do a lot of my active engagement with time thinkers around the world, is on my Twitter account, Dr. Time. I use this alter ego as a kind of container for the science that I do around time. So it's just Dr. Time on Twitter. That's probably the best place to engage with me.
I love that.
Currently.
I love that. You've created a separate space to explore time. There's so many metaphors we could go into there, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much, Eddie.
No worries.